June 3, 1942. Dutch harbor burns under Japanese bombs. Black smoke mixing with fog so thick you can't see the man beside you. But what terrified Admiral Theobald wasn't the enemy fleet steaming west. It was the weather report sitting on his desk. Typhoon force winds, sub-zero temperatures by September, and 144,000 American troops with nowhere to sleep except canvas tents that were already disintegrating in the Aleutian gales. The Japanese had just bombed American soil for the first time since 1812, and the War Department's response was immediate. Fortify the Aleutians, build air bases. Across the island chain, stop Japan's northern advance before it reached Alaska. But there was a problem no one in Washington had accounted for. The Aleutians weren't just remote, they were geologically hostile to human life. Treeless volcanic rock, winds that never stopped, rain that fell sideways, 200 days a year, and a winter so brutal that men standing watch would be found frozen to their rifles. Army Corps of Engineers Major Robert Littell arrived at Adak Island on June 15th, with orders to construct housing for 30,000 men by October. He stepped off the transport ship into wind so strong it knocked his clipboard into the ocean. Around him, engineer battalions were already trying to pitch tents, and watching them explode into ribbons within minutes. The wind wasn't gusting. It was constant, sustained, unrelenting, a horizontal river of air moving at 60, 70, sometimes 90 miles per hour, without ever slowing down. Littell's first report back to Washington was 8 words long. Canvas will not work. We need something else. Before we go further, subscribe, because every week we dig into the disasters, the storms, and the impossible deadlines that forced engineers to invent things the textbook said couldn't be done. This is one of those stories. The problem facing the Corps wasn't just Adak, it was the entire Aleutian chain, 1,000 miles of volcanic islands stretching toward Japan, every one of them critical, every one of them uninhabitable. Attu, Kiska, Amchitka, Shemya, islands where the ground was permafrost and volcanic ash, where you couldn't dig a foundation because 3 feet down you hit either ice or lava rock, where every storm came in off the Bering Sea with enough force to flip a bulldozer, and the clock was running. Tokyo knew the Aleutians were the weak point in America's northern flank. If Japan could hold Attu and Kiska, they could bomb Alaska, threaten the Lend-Lease supply line to Russia, maybe even force a two-front war. The United States had to move faster, but first, they had to figure out how to keep their men alive long enough to fight. Traditional barracks were out. Wood frame construction required lumber, carpenters, and time, none of which existed in the Aleutians. The islands had no trees. Timber had to be shipped from the Pacific Northwest, a 3-week voyage through submarine-infested waters, and even if it arrived, you needed skilled carpenters to build with it. The Army had carpenters back in Georgia training. In the Aleutians, they had infantrymen, artillerymen, engineers who could blow a bridge but couldn't frame a wall. The British had a solution: Nissen huts, semicircular corrugated steel shelters 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, developed in World War I. The Army ordered 5,000 of them in July, shipped them to Adak by August, and discovered immediately that they didn't work. The problem was the floor. British Nissen huts had wooden floors that sat directly on the ground, which meant you had to level the ground first, dig footings, pour foundations. On volcanic rock and permafrost, that was impossible. Engineers spent 4 days trying to level a single building site on Adak, gave up, and assembled the hut anyway. It listed 11 degrees to the southwest. When the wind hit, it peeled the corrugated panels off like aluminum foil. But the real problem with Nissen huts wasn't structural. It was thermal. Inside, they were ovens. The corrugated steel absorbed every bit of solar radiation during the brief Aleutian summer, turning the interior into a 110-degree sauna. Men couldn't sleep. They couldn't work. They started passing out from heat exhaustion in a place where the outside temperature was 50 degrees. And when winter came, the huts turned into freezers, the steel sucking heat out of the air so fast that men woke with frostbite on their fingertips. Littell sent another report to Washington. In September, Nissen huts unsuitable, requesting immediate alternative or casualty rates will exceed combat losses. He wasn't exaggerating. By October, more men were being evacuated for exposure and cold weather injuries than for enemy action. Pneumonia was spreading through the tent camps. Trench foot was epidemic, and the worst of the winter hadn't even started yet. Meteorologists were predicting sustained winds of 100 mph by December, temperatures down to 20 below zero with wind chill pushing it to -60. If the army didn't have real shelter by then, men were going to die not in combat, but in their sleep. The man who solved it wasn't an architect. He was a structural engineer from Pennsylvania named Peter Neff, working for a small steel fabrication company called Great Lakes Steel. Neff had spent the 1930s designing agricultural buildings, silos, grain elevators, machine sheds, and he'd learned one thing. If you want a structure to survive extreme weather, you make it as simple as possible. No joints to fail, no corners to catch wind, no floor to rot, just a single continuous curve of steel, ribs, and skin, locked together so tightly that the whole building acts as one piece. In late September 1942, Neff got a call from the War Department. They described the problem. House 100,000 men on islands with no foundations, no lumber, no skilled labor, and winds that never stop. Oh, and they need it in 4 months. Neff asked for 3 days to think about it. What he came back with looked insane. A half-cylinder of corrugated steel, 20 feet wide and 48 feet long, with no floor, no frame, and no foundation. Just a steel arch, prefabricated in sections, bolted together on site, and anchored directly into the ground with steel stakes. The entire structure weighed 3,800 pounds, shipped flat in a crate the size of a pickup truck, and could be assembled by 6 men in 4 hours, none of them carpenters. The Corps of Engineers thought he was crazy. No floor? How do you live in a building with no floor? Neff's answer was simple. You don't need a floor if the ground is stable, and in the Aleutians the ground is volcanic rock. Just grade it flat, cover it with gravel or wood duckboards, and you're done. No rot, no termites, no foundation settling. And because the building sits directly on the ground, the earth itself becomes thermal mass. It stabilizes the interior. Temperature keeps it from swinging between oven and freezer. The half-cylinder shape was equally deliberate. Wind doesn't catch a curve, it flows over it. A rectangular building in 120 metric winds acts like a sail. A Quonset hut acts like a river stone. The wind splits around it, reunites on the other side, and keeps going. No uplift, no shear stress, just smooth airflow. Neff had done the math. A properly anchored Quonset could survive sustained winds up to 150 mph. The Aleutians had never recorded anything higher than 140. But the real genius was in the fabrication. Neff designed the hut so that every piece was identical and interchangeable. 16 curved ribs, each one pre-drilled with bolt holes at exact intervals. Corrugated steel panels that slid into place like puzzle pieces. No measuring required. You didn't need blueprints. You didn't need supervision. You could teach a man to assemble a Quonset in 20 minutes, and after that, he could build one in the dark. The War Department ordered a prototype in October. It arrived at Adak on November 2, 1942, in the middle of a storm with sustained winds of 85 km/h. 6 engineers assembled it in 3.5 hours while being knocked off their feet by gusts. When they finished, they went inside, lit a kerosene heater, and waited. The storm hit full force that night. Winds topped 110 mph. The Nissen huts next door started losing panels. One of them collapsed completely, the frame buckling under shear load. The Quonset didn't move. It didn't flex. It didn't creak. The wind screamed over the curved roof and kept going. And inside, the temperature held steady at 55 degrees. Littell walked into that Quonset at dawn and stood there for 5 minutes without saying anything. Then he radioed Washington. Approve. Immediate mass production. This works. By December 1942, Great Lakes Steel had retooled their entire factory for Quonset production. They were stamping out 1,500 huts a week, shipping them to the Aleutians in Liberty ships that carried nothing else. By March 1943, there were 8,000 Quonsets across. The island chain, barracks, mess halls, hospitals, headquarters, ammunition storage, repair shops, even chapels. The huts weren't just housing. They were infrastructure. They were the skeleton of an entire military-industrial operation built on rock that had never supported a permanent structure before. And the men stopped dying. Pneumonia rates dropped by 60%. Cold weather casualties fell to nearly zero. Morale improved, not because the Quonsets were comfortable, but because they were reliable. Soldiers knew that when they came off patrol in a blizzard, there would be a heated space, waiting. They knew the roof wouldn't blow off in the night. They knew the building would still be standing in the morning. But the real test came in January 1943, when the worst storm in Aleutian recorded history slammed into Attic. Winds sustained at 128 mph for 11 hours. Gusts measured at 147. Visibility dropped to zero. The storm tore an entire pier off its moorings and threw it half a mile inland. It flipped trucks. It shredded aircraft tied down on the runway. Engineers huddled in their Quonsets and listened to the wind trying to rip the bolts out of the ground. When it was over, not a single Quonset had failed. A few had lost end panels where the doors were. Wind had found the weak point and blown them in. But the main structure, the arch itself, hadn't moved. The Corps sent a team to inspect the anchoring system. Expecting to find bent stakes, sheared bolts, cracked welds, they found nothing. The steel had held. The design had worked exactly as Neff said it would. By the end of World War II, the United States had manufactured over 170,000 Quonset huts. They weren't just in the Aleutians, they were everywhere. North Africa, Italy, France, the Pacific Theater, Iceland, Greenland. Wherever the military went, the Quonsets went with them because they solved a problem no other structure could. How do you build fast, light, and strong when you have no time, no materials, and no margin for error? The huts became so ubiquitous that soldiers stopped seeing them as temporary. They started painting them, decorating them, building wooden porches, planting gardens outside, hanging signs with unit numbers and nicknames. In some bases, Quonset stood for so long that they became permanent. The temporary hospital at Camp Lejeune operated out of Quonsets until 1972, 30 years after they were erected. And when the war ended, the Quonsets didn't disappear. The government sold tens of thousands of them as surplus, and they scattered across America like seeds. Farmers bought them for equipment sheds. Small towns bought them for community centers, fire stations, and churches. Colleges bought them for classrooms and dormitories. Entire universities, swollen with returning GIs on the GI Bill, ran out of Quonsets for years. At the University of North Dakota, students lived in Quonset villages well into the 1960s. At Cornell, the huts were still standing in the 1980s. But the story doesn't end in America. Because what the Quonsets proved in the Aleutians was this: you don't need complex architecture to save lives. You need geometry that works, materials that last, and a design simple enough that anyone can build it under pressure. That lesson didn't stay military. It went humanitarian. In 1951, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees started using modified Quonsets to shelter displaced persons in Europe and Asia. In 1960, after the Chilean earthquake, relief organizations shipped Quonsets to Valdivia to house 10,000 people whose homes had collapsed. In 1972, after the Nicaragua earthquake leveled Managua, the first structures erected in the ruins were Quonsets, because they could be flown in on cargo planes, assembled by untrained volunteers, and withstand aftershocks that were still collapsing masonry buildings. In 1991, after the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines displaced 500,000 people, Quonsets became the backbone of the refugee camps. In 2005, after Hurricane Katrina, FEMA deployed Quonsets across the Gulf Coast as temporary shelters, medical stations, and supply depots. In 2010, after the Haiti earthquake, international NGOs used them for field hospitals, because you could sterilize the steel interior and it didn't rot in tropical heat. The design evolved. Modern versions use insulated panels, modular end walls, better anchoring systems, but the core geometry stayed the same. A half-cylinder, no floor, bolted together, curved to shed wind and rain, simple enough to build in a crisis. And then in the 2010s, something strange happened. Architects started looking at Quonsets again, not as emergency shelter but as sustainable design, because the huts had an accidental feature no one had planned for. They lasted forever. Galvanized steel doesn't rot, it doesn't burn, it doesn't attract pests. A Quonset built in 1943 could still be standing in 2023, 80 years later, with nothing but a fresh coat of paint. In an age obsessed with sustainability and low impact construction, the Quonset suddenly looked less like a relic and more like a prototype. People started converting them into homes, off-grid cabins, artist studios, workshops, breweries. Entire businesses run out of refurbished Quonsets because the structure is so open and flexible you can do almost anything inside. No load-bearing walls, no columns, Just 20 feet of clear span, 48 feet deep, waiting for you to decide what it becomes. Tentar Novamente Gok, and in 2018, NASA started testing Quonset-derived structures for Mars habitats. The logic was identical to 1942. You need shelter that can be prefabricated, shipped flat, assembled by non-specialists, and survive extreme conditions with zero maintenance. Mars has sustained winds up to 60 miles per hour and temperature swings of 170 degrees Fahrenheit between day and night. A curved, self-supporting steel shell, partially buried in regolith for thermal mass and radiation shielding, started looking less like a vintage military relic and more like the optimal solution to a problem that wouldn't exist for another 20 years. The engineers at NASA's Langley Research Center didn't call them Quonsets. They called them deployable rigid shell habitats. But when you looked at the CAD models, the shape was unmistakable. A half-cylinder, prefabricated ribs, panels that locked together. The same geometry Peter Neff had sketched in a Pennsylvania factory in 1942, now being reimagined for a planet where the wind never stops and nothing can ever rot, because there's no water to rot it. But here's the part that almost got lost to history. The Quonset hut wasn't named after Neff, or Great Lakes Steel, or even the War Department engineers who approved it. It was named after the place where the first mass production happened, Quonset Point, Rhode Island, a Naval Construction Battalion facility, Seabees, where in late 1942, they built the first assembly line specifically designed to mass-produce shelter faster than the enemy could destroy it. At peak production in 1943, the Quonset Point facility and its subcontractors were manufacturing one hut every 30 minutes. They came off the line like cars, palletized and crated, loaded onto trucks that drove them straight to the docks where Liberty ships waited with engines running. The entire supply chain, from raw steel to deployed shelter, took less than 3 weeks. In modern terms, that's faster than Amazon. In 1943 terms, it was logistical sorcery, and it had to be, because by mid-1943, the war had metastasized. The Aleutians were just one front. North Africa needed huts for field hospitals in the desert, where temperatures hit 130 degrees and sandstorms stripped paint off. Metal. Italy needed them for ammunition depots in the mountains, where snow loads could collapse a poorly designed roof. The Pacific needed them on atolls where there was no land above sea level, except coral rubble and a few palm trees. Every environment, every climate, every impossible condition. And the Quonset worked in all of them, because the design didn't fight the environment. It surrendered to it. In the Sahara, they painted them white and buried the lower half in sand for thermal insulation. In the Aleutians, they banked them with gravel and volcanic rock. In the South Pacific, they elevated them on coral block piers to let air circulate underneath and keep the interior from turning into a greenhouse. The modifications were local, improvised, and effective, because the base structure was so simple that soldiers could adapt it without engineering degrees. There's a story from Guadalcanal, November 1943. A Navy medical unit had just received 12 Quonsets to replace their tent hospital, which had been shredded by a typhoon 2 weeks earlier. They assembled the first hut in 5 hours, moved the surgical equipment inside, and were operating on wounded Marines. By nightfall, the next morning another storm hit. Not as bad as the typhoon, but sustained winds over 70 miles, heavy rain, lightning. The surgical team kept working. The lights flickered once when a generator coughed, but the building didn't move, didn't leak, didn't groan. One of the surgeons, a man named Captain Richard Hornberger, who would later write the novel MASH, wrote in his diary, "Worked through the storm, didn't even know it was happening until someone told me after. The hut is louder than a tent but steadier than a building." That line, steadier than a building, captured something essential. The Quonset wasn't architecture in the classical sense. It wasn't trying to be beautiful or permanent or impressive. It was trying to be reliable. And in war, reliability is the highest form of design. A building that works when everything else has failed isn't just useful, it's sacred. By 1944, the Quonset had become so standardized that the military developed an entire ecosystem around it. Insulation kits for cold climates, ventilation kits for hot climates, partition walls to divide the interior into rooms, wooden floors that could be installed after assembly if the ground was too uneven, end wall kits with windows, doors, or vehicle bay openings. You could configure a Quonset for almost any purpose, and the configurability was built into the logistics. Every modification shipped as a flat pack add-on that bolted into the same pre-drilled holes. This wasn't just engineering, it was systems thinking. The Quonset wasn't a product, it was a platform, and that's why it survived the war. Because once you have a platform that works, people start building on top of it, extending it, adapting it for problems you never imagined. In 1945, as the war wound down, the Army started decommissioning bases and faced a new problem. What do you do with 170,000 steel huts scattered across 6 continents? The answer was supposed to be simple: dismantle them, scrap the steel, move on. But that's not what happened. Because in places where infrastructure had been destroyed, France, Italy, the Philippines, Okinawa, the Quonsets were the only intact buildings left standing. So they stayed. In France, liberated towns used them as temporary schools, while they rebuilt the ones the Germans had bombed. In Italy, they became community centers, clinics, and warehouses. In Okinawa, they became the foundation of the post-war reconstruction. American forces left behind hundreds of Quonsets when they withdrew, and Okinawans turned them into homes, shops, restaurants, and workshops. Some of those huts are still there, 75 years later, repainted and repurposed so many times that no one remembers they were ever military. And in America, the Quonsets became a symbol of the boom that followed the war. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to college, and universities didn't have enough dormitories, so they bought surplus Quonsets by the hundreds. At Indiana University, an entire neighborhood of Quonsets sprang up in 1946, married student housing nicknamed Splinterville, because the interiors were raw plywood and exposed ribs. Families lived there, raised children there, graduated and moved on, and for years afterward, IU alumni would come back and ask to see their old Quonset, the one where they'd studied for finals or celebrated VE Day or brought their first baby home from the hospital. The huts weren't comfortable. They were cold in winter, hot in summer, and the acoustics were terrible. Every sound echoed off the steel, but they were home, in the way that any reliable shelter becomes home when you've lived through chaos. The veterans who lived in them had survived Normandy, Iwo Jima, the Bulge. A curved steel hut with a kerosene heater and a shared bathroom wasn't luxury, but it was peace, and that was enough. By the 1950s, Quonsets were everywhere, but they were also invisible, so common that people stopped noticing them. They became part of the landscape, the way telephone poles or fire hydrants become invisible. You'd see them in farm fields, behind factories, at the edge of small-town airports. Some were maintained, painted, fitted with real doors and windows. Others were left to rust, weeds growing up around the base, corrugated panels streaked with orange oxidation but still structurally sound. Steel doesn't surrender easily. In the 1970s and 80s, as America started tearing down its post-war infrastructure, a lot of Quonsets disappeared. Universities demolished them to build modern dorms. Towns tore them down to make way for parking lots. But enough survived that by the 2000s, preservationists started paying attention. The National Park Service listed several historic Quonset sites. Architectural historians started writing about them, not as temporary structures but as a distinct typology, a uniquely American form of vernacular architecture born from crisis. And then, the crisis came back. Hurricane Katrina, the Haiti earthquake, the Nepal earthquake, the Syrian refugee crisis. Suddenly, the problem of 1942 was the problem of 2010. How do you shelter tens of thousands of people fast with no existing infrastructure, in conditions that will destroy anything fragile? And the answer kept coming back to the same geometry: the half-cylinder, the prefab arch, the structure that doesn't need a foundation and doesn't fight the wind. Modern disaster relief doesn't use literal Quonsets anymore. They use descendants, insulated fabric structures tensioned over steel frames, shipping containers modified with curved roofs, modular polymer panels that clip together like the original corrugated steel. But the logic is identical. Ship it flat, build it fast, make it strong enough to survive the next storm. In 2017, after Hurricane Maria destroyed 90% of the structures in Dominica, relief organizations erected a field hospital using a modified Quonset design. Steel ribs, insulated panels assembled in 2E in days by a team of 8. The hospital operated for 14 months, treated over 11,000 patients, And when the permanent hospital was rebuilt, they disassembled the Quonset and shipped it to the next disaster. That's the other thing Neff's design got right. Reversibility. You can take it apart as easily as you put it together, and every piece is reusable. There's a Quonset hut in Antarctica right now. It was built in 1956 as part of Operation Deep Freeze, one of the first permanent American research stations on the continent. It's been refurbished 6 times, insulated and re-insulated, fitted with modern heating systems and solar panels. But the bones are still original. The same curved steel ribs, the same corrugated panels, the same bolted connections. It survived 67 Antarctic winters, winds over 100 mph, temperatures down to -80, and it's still standing because the design doesn't have weak points. There's nothing to break because there's almost nothing there, just steel and geometry. And that's the legacy. Not that the Quonset was a great building, it wasn't. It was cold, loud, ugly, and uncomfortable. But it worked when nothing else did, and it kept working long after it was supposed to be gone. It outlasted the war it was built for. It outlasted the century it was built in. And every time we face a disaster that destroys everything complicated, we come back to the same idea. A curve of steel, anchored to the ground, simple enough to build in the dark. Peter Neff died in 1988, mostly forgotten outside of engineering circles. He never won any architectural awards. His name isn't on a building, but his geometry is still out there, scattered across the world in 1,000 variations. Shelters for refugees, workshops for farmers, storage for small-town fire departments, and laboratories on the ice. Quiet, unnoticed, doing exactly what it was designed to do 70 years ago. Stand up when everything else falls down. If stories like this remind you why we study the structures that don't get remembered, the ones built too fast to be beautiful but too well to ever disappear, subscribe, because the next one goes deeper into the machines, the bridges, and the supply lines that held the world together when everything was falling apart. They built it for men freezing in a war no one thought we could win. And somewhere tonight, someone is sleeping under that same curve of steel, safe from a storm they didn't see coming.